Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Aga Khan Museum. My name is Giovanna Scarsone, and I'm the education manager here, and I'm very excited to see you all here on this gloomy, rainy day. And we're pleased to welcome you to the museum, where our mission is to connect cultures through art. Today we welcome Shamez Mohamed, who will talk to us about our beautiful museum building and all the thought that went into it, the construction of the building, not just with the four walls around us and the roof over our head, but the inspiration and the ultimate goals of the museum. As we talk about the museum building and site, it's appropriate for us to acknowledge the land on which the Aga Khan Museum sits. The land is known as Tekaronto, and we honor the stewardship, past, present, and future, of the Huron-Wendat, the Iroquois Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the New Credit. It's also a good time to remind you to make sure your phones are on silent. There's no photos or video during the talk. And it gives me great pleasure now to introduce Shamez Mohamed. Shamez is the executive officer of Imara Wynford Drive Limited and Imara Sussex Drive Limited. Shamez led a dedicated team of staff and volunteers in the management projects including the Ismaili Centre Toronto and the Aga Khan Museum, the Aga Khan Park, the delegation of the Ismaili Imamat in Ottawa, and the Global Centre for Pluralism in Ottawa. Shamez recently completed a 6-year term as a member of the advisory board for the Museum of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from Harvard University and an MBA from the Ivey School of Business at the University of Western Ontario. Please join me in welcoming Shamez to the podium.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Giovanna. I'm excited to be here. I'm honored to be speaking with you today about a subject that's very dear to my heart, having spent the last 12 and a half years in the process of its development. I will attempt to share with you my perspectives on how the design of the beautiful Aga Khan Museum was inspired by light. And while not always apparent, there's a lot of thinking and work that goes into the development and launching of a new museum, especially one that is as specialized as the Aga Khan Museum. And I also want to point out, and you'll see this as a theme in the lecture, that the choices made by architects, especially good architects, are deliberate. They're not accidents. Sometimes we have accidents, but for the most part, the design itself is deliberate. I had the good fortune of being involved in the development of this project from its conception through the design and construction phases up till its opening in September of 2014. And it took a lot of effort and scores of people to make this happen. And I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the many individuals who were involved in the development of this wonderful project. So there are many aspects of the development we could discuss, and there are a few things in my intro which we could actually have complete lectures on. But today I'll focus specifically on the question or the notion of light and how it inspired various architectural elements in the building. So let me begin with some context. The Aga Khan Museum is an initiative of the Aga Khan Development Network, of which His Highness the Aga Khan is the chairman. Specifically, the Aga Khan Museum falls under the purview of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. And the Aga Khan Trust for Culture is an agency of the AKDN, which also is responsible for the triannual Aga Khan Award for Architecture. It's one of the world's largest prizes in architecture, as well as the Historic Cities Program, which is an initiative that restores historical monuments in the Muslim world in a responsible manner which has community-wide impact. And again, each of these has huge stories, wonderful success stories that I'd love to share with you at some point if we could, but today's not that day. So coming back to the Aga Khan Development Network, it is a network of agencies that are committed to the upliftment of the quality of life of people who are underprivileged and marginalized. The network's efforts are primarily focused in the developing world. Their major activities are in East and West Africa, in South Asia and Central Asia, and also has activities in Egypt, Syria, and Portugal. To give you a sense of how large this organization is, it works in 30 different countries, employs over 80,000 people. Its not-for-profit budget is $625 million annually. It also runs for-profit initiatives that serve as model investments that take community involvement and upliftment very seriously. And those initiatives have annual revenues of over $3.5 billion. So it's a very large organization. And the investment that is made in Canada is in many ways unprecedented. But I'm sure it's part of a much bigger vision that is unfolding in front of us slowly. Allow me now to give you a little bit of context on the timelines. In 2003, the Aga Khan Development Network announced that the Aga Khan Museum would be built in Toronto. In 2004, we engaged Maki & Associates as the designers of the Aga Khan Museum. And from 2006 through 2009, Maki & Associates worked with a local architect, Moriyama and Toshima Architects out of Toronto, to develop the design. And then from 2010 through 2014, we went through the process of construction and fit out and the eventual opening in September of 2014. So now with that context, perhaps we can get into the discussion on today's topic. I will start by reading a quote from a letter that His Highness wrote to Maki in January of 2006 as a part of the design directive. It reads, "Dear Professor Maki, the notion of light has traversed almost all of human history and has been an inspiration for numerous human faiths. Decades of human history are referred to as the Enlightenment for good reason. The goal would be to capture the days and night sources of light, to create a sense of iridescence, reflectivity, and a glow on the building's elevations, and to use various manifestations of that light to emphasize subtle colors. The finishing materials of the facades will have to be carefully selected and perhaps even specially developed. It has always struck me how many specimens of natural stone and of geodites contain elements of metal, such that when these stones are sectioned and polished, their reflectivity under certain angles of light and viewing is heightened. In this manner, and through a much longer letter, Professor Maki was given the challenging task of designing a building that was inspired by light. So what did His Highness mean when he referred to the notion of light? I've done some quick research. Thank you, Google. That reveals that there are many ways in which we use the word light, in many contexts. Sometimes we don't even think about it, and we're using it. It's used as an adjective. Something light-colored, something that's not forceful. It could be used as a verb. It could also be used as a noun. But I don't think that these were the types of meanings that His Highness meant when he referred to the notion of light. So when we move from the literal meanings and flirt with the metaphor and the allegory, we're brought closer to the intended, implied meaning. So it's words like enlightenment, inspiration, transparency, openness. These are the words that are closer to what he meant. So coming back to Professor Maki, and his challenge. He had to figure out how light was going to inspire his design, while reconciling that design with a very critical functional requirement of keeping light out of the galleries. I'm sure many of you know that museums are not very fond of light, mostly because the artifacts, and especially the artifacts we have in this museum, are sensitive to light and need to be protected from light. So he had quite a task trying to figure out how to solve this problem. But based on his understanding of the requirements and reflecting on the design directive he had been given, Professor Maki responded with a design that had at its center an open, light-filled courtyard with the various functional spaces like the galleries and the auditorium built around it. We call this the big move. This was his primary decision. How am I going to get light into this museum? And you can see the date on this particular sketch that Professor Maki made was January 2006. So it was days after he got the design directive that he developed this sketch. And this sketch was then presented as a concept to His Highness and the advisory group that was working on the project. And that design was accepted. That concept was accepted. And the layout that we have today was based on that concept and remains true to the intentions of that concept, where you can see at the center of it, you've got the courtyard, and then around it, you've got the functional spaces of the galleries and the auditorium. So for the remainder of the talk, I will examine how various characteristics or properties of light have been incorporated into the architectural elements of Maki's design. And I will use this very scientific assessment criteria that I developed to tell you how and which element is the most successful. You might think that the assessment criteria is a little bit rigged, only because the element I coincidentally like the most has the best marks. But we'll get there, and I'll let you be the judge of it. So we can start with the massing of the building. Massing is the overall exterior shape of the building. And many of you maybe asked yourselves, I hope you did anyway, asked yourselves, why is the building shaped the way it is? As you can observe from the photograph, it looks like the building has been pinched at the waist, as if an imaginary belt has been tightened a little bit more than it should have. I feel that way sometimes, especially around Thanksgiving. You can see how the lower walls are inclined in and the upper walls are cantilevered out. So not only does this shape create an interesting and appealing visual, but it allows the architect to play with the ideas of shadows and reflections. But even then, it's not quite as simple. And in order to achieve the right orientation of the building and to optimize the extent of the cantilever, or in other words, how tight the belt should be, Maki and Associates undertook various studies. From considering how the sun moved through the sky, through the seasons, and across time, to specifically studying the impact of that on the building. And what you see in the image in front of you is how the building looks different at different times of the day, and how at the same time of the day, depending on the season, it would yet look different again. This is the way in which Maki used the shape of the building to create more interest by creating shadows and glow spots that changed throughout the year. And this is, again, that reminder that design choices are deliberate and made with clear objectives and sound study. They don't happen by accident. From the massing, we can move on to consider the cladding material, or the material that adorns the exterior of the building. The choice of the of cladding is another important decision, because together with the massing, it is really the item that gives the building its outward identity. And Maki was keen to explore a variety of options, which he did. And he came back to tell the group that he really liked the way in which the white marble had been used on the Taj Mahal, that the marble displayed qualities of luminosity, reflectivity, and even had elements of color, whereby it was reflecting the color of the sky at certain times of the day. As a concept, it was something that was well received, and Maki was asked to proceed on that basis. His challenge then was to find a suitable material. Now, marble would have been an obvious choice for us, but unfortunately, Southern Ontario is not very kind to marble installed on an exterior surface, and so he had to look for something else. But being very keen on marble, he found us marbles from Sweden and Vermont that had the hardness of limestone. But we had just also in Toronto gone through a situation with one of the buildings downtown had marble panels falling off its side because of deterioration due to the weather and acid rain. And so it was something that nobody really was willing to put their name behind. And so he had to go back to the drawing table to look for something else. And it was then that he identified a white granite from Brazil that was ultimately selected as the material to clad the building. And it took a lot of due diligence and reviews before that material was selected. And I think at the end of it, the choice of material was one that was well made and something that achieves the objective that Maki had set out for himself with regards to getting the color and the luminosity and the reflectivity and the shadows. We can turn our attention to the courtyard. Now this is where you'll notice that my favorite part of the building gets 5 out of 5 on my wonderful arbitrary scientific scale. It is one of my favorite places in the museum. So according to Maki, the courtyard design was inspired by the traditional Mush Rabia, or screen, that is commonly used in many parts of the world. Maki specifically referred to an example of a Mush Rabia from the tomb of Salim Chishti in Fatehpur Sikri in India. This was a screen that was built by Mughal stoneworkers in the 16th century, and he particularly liked the three-dimensional nature of this screen because it's cut out of stone. So while again, there were many parts of, many inspirations for the courtyard, the one that we all feel was the most successful was the application of the pattern on the glass that adorns the courtyard. So in order to create this three-dimensional feeling. So Maki wanted to try and create this three-dimensionality, but he was working with glass. So one way in which he did it was to apply the pattern on 2 surfaces of the double glazed unit. And after preparing a large-scale sample, almost a full-size mock-up, to test whether or not this would work, it was a concept that was then accepted, and we thought it would be a great success. But I have to say that the outcomes have exceeded all our expectations. These are just pictures that I've selected just to illustrate how effective the panels have been in terms of creating shadows and a sense of transparency, reflectivity, etc. And this is one of my favorite pictures, so I've thrown it in as well, so you can see it. But one of the things that is, again, deceptive about the work that Maki does is that it looks very simple and looks very clean. But let me tell you, to construct it, it is very, very difficult. Just to give you a sense, the columns in the courtyard are 12-meter high columns made of a single piece of solid steel with sharp edges. And if that wasn't enough, that 12-meter column has to be perfectly straight. The tolerances that were given to the manufacturer and the installer were plus or minus 4 millimeters, and not cumulative, which meant that the steel had to be perfectly straight so that the glass pieces that were coming in between and the cross bracing was properly aligned. And it took some magic to make it happen. I remember being on site and getting the initial report of the installation, only to be told that none of them were straight and all of them were off by centimeters. I was like, how are we going to solve this problem? And the installer said to me, don't worry, I have a magician on my staff. And I have to say that he really was. So as an older gentleman who perhaps has been working with steel all his life, was around the courtyard for 2 weeks on a genie lift with a blowtorch. And he identified specific spots that he would heat up. He wouldn't bang anything, move it, just heating specific spots. And somehow, the steel got aligned. I don't know how he did it. I believe it's a bit of magic. But he had to make sure that those were perfectly straight, so the stuff that came in afterwards was also aligned. Those are the kinds of demands that Maki made on the contractor and the designers, and certainly put everyone to the test. Next, we'll look at the hexagonal skylights in the galleries, which we affectionately call the Honeycomb Skylights. There are 6 such skylights, 3 on the east roof line and 3 on the south roof line. You remember I had mentioned earlier that the galleries, because they contained some of these very sensitive artifacts, could not have a lot of light. So Maki's challenge was, how do I bring natural light into the galleries without adversely impacting the collection? And so he recalled for us these high-set screened windows at the mosque of Sheikh Lutfullah in Isfahan, which allowed a gentle, diffused light to fall upon the congregation below. And it was this kind of approach that he suggested would be one that he would like to use for the galleries in order to respect the sensitivity of the collection. In principle, the skylights connect the inside to the outside and bring in natural light. They also serve to provide some relief along the exterior, again creating shadows and mysterious shapes on a roof line that otherwise would be very straight. The skylights themselves were also very unique in that these were bespoke skylights. They were built here in Cambridge, Ontario. And each of the 6 skylights has 84 hexagonal pockets that are filled with triple glazed frosted glass, and altogether create about a 15% opening in the surface of the skylight, allowing that very diffused light to come through. The installation of these skylights was not easy. You can imagine these are all pre-assembled in Cambridge, shipped to Toronto, and then hoisted onto these metal supports that were already constructed in the roof of the building. Not only that, the actual final completion of these skylights was extremely complicated and required the coordination between several trades, including the drywall trades, the structural framing trades, the waterproofing guys, metal cladding on the outside, the stone cladding which abuts it, the electricals, the blackout blinds, and they all had to work together to make this very complicated shape, which is placed at an angle, work. But something, again, that one might say is an iconic element of Maki's work on this building. Next, we'll talk about the Mush Rabia. So we've talked about the Mush Rabia as an inspiration for the glass on the courtyard, but we also actually have Mush Rabias in this building. And these are pictures from, photos from Cairo. And I'd mentioned earlier that wood was a common material used to create these screens. And in Cairo specifically, these Mush Rabia were installed on balconies that looked over some of the alleyways where people would walk. And what they did was they allowed people to look out of these balconies but not be seen, allowed natural light through while providing privacy. And this was an important element Maki felt he would like to somehow incorporate into the balconies at the museum. We have 4 balconies. All of them look onto the lobby of the museum. And he wanted to try and recreate that sense of being in a high place looking down on a busy alleyway. And in order to do that, he came up with a modern interpretation of the Mush Rabia. He wanted to use extruded aluminum pieces fastened together mechanically to create this Mush Rabia. Unfortunately for us, the aluminum option was not a feasible option. However, he was determined to get some kind of Mush Rabia going here at the museum. And he found a company in Toronto that was able to cast zinc. So you can see again, the components are very similar, the shape is very similar, but instead of using extruded aluminum, we were able to use zinc to create these pieces that were then fastened together to create the screen. And similar to the picture you saw earlier, when you look dead on to the screen, it has this appearance of being very light and transparent almost. However, you can see from this image that it's quite a deep piece of metal. So if you look at it at an angle, sometimes it's almost opaque. This is one of my favorite elements. If you haven't seen it, you should maybe go upstairs if they're able to. There's one in the kind of the anteroom of the auditorium upstairs that you can actually look at closely. And finally, let's turn our attention to the night views. Maki's liberal use of glass around the exterior of the building, at the entrance, at the patrons' lounge, in the clear story above the patrons' lounge, the restaurant, the galleries, the courtyard, all of these allow the building to glow at night. And if you look carefully at this picture, you will see the reflection of the Ismaili Center at the entrance. And again, this was not an accident. It was very much an intentional move on the part of Professor Maki. I remember him showing us a rendering that looked out of the building. This was before the construction happened. I remember seeing this rendering where you're looking out of the main entrance towards the Ismaili Center. And you'll notice that the entrance is not at the center of the building, but rather askew. And when you look out of that entrance, you see the roof of the Ismaili Center framed by that entrance. And he said to us at that time that he felt it was important, A, to acknowledge that the Ismaili Center was a related facility, but B, that he felt that that kind of a space and that kind of a building should be considered the most important artifact that you'll be able to see from the museum. It's unusual for an architect of his stature to celebrate the work of another architect. I've been told that they don't like to do that. So, in conclusion, let me read you another extract from the letter that His Highness wrote to Maki in January. And this was the aspiration. He says, "I hope that the building and the spaces around it will be seen as a celebration of light and the mysteries of light that nature and the human soul illustrate to us at every moment of our lives. This concept, of course, is particularly validated in Islamic texts and sciences, signed by the Aga Khan. So Maki understood the vision. He also understood the very real challenge in front of him. And in his inimitable, simply complex way, Maki designed a masterpiece inspired by light. So that concludes the talk. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.